The plate was not supposed to tip. That was Brio Hartwell's first thought as $42 worth of handmade truffle pasta slid sideways off the tray and kissed the edge of a $2,000 tablecloth. His second thought was considerably less calm. The dining room of Virelli's went silent the way a room only goes silent when something very bad is about to happen to someone who probably didn't deserve it. Crystal glasses stopped clinking. Forks hovered midair. Even the candlelight seemed to hold its breath. Brio did not run. He stood there. 7 months pregnant. Uniform already too tight at the buttons. A smear of wine creeping toward the linen like it had somewhere important to be. The table nearest the spill held 4 men in suits who looked like they had never personally encountered consequences. They stared at him with the kind of cold assessment that usually preceded either a lawsuit or a disappearance. Brio looked back at them. Then at the pasta. Then at the wine. "I'm so sorry," he said, already reaching for the linen from his apron pocket. "Give me 30 seconds. Nobody moved. Behind him, he heard Jasmine from the hostess desk make a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a prayer. Marcus from the kitchen had gone completely still in the service doorway. Even Chef Beaumont, a man who once screamed for 11 minutes about improperly folded napkins, said absolutely nothing. That was when Brio noticed the second table. The one in the back left corner. The one that was always reserved. The one nobody ever talked about except in hushed voices and sideways glances. 3 men sat there. Each one broad-shouldered. Each one watching him with an expression that carried no readable emotion whatsoever. No anger. No amusement. No impatience. Just attention. Pure, unbroken, focused attention. And all 3 of them were looking directly at him. Brio's hand stopped moving against the tablecloth. He had worked at Virelli's for 3 weeks. He had heard the name plenty of times. Every staff member had offered some version of the same warning on his first day. Don't approach that table. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't make mistakes near them. He had now done all 3 simultaneously. The wine kept spreading. One of the 3 men tilted his head slightly. Not threatening. Not warm. Just watching. Like Brio was a puzzle he hadn't decided whether to solve yet. Brio turned back to the tablecloth and kept cleaning. Because the pasta wasn't going to clean itself. And standing frozen in a luxury restaurant with 3 Alpha Kings staring at him, while 7 months pregnant was not, in fact, going to improve the situation. At least that's what he told himself. But his hands had started shaking. And all 3 men were still watching. The eviction notice was typed in a very professional font. Brio appreciated that, in a grim sort of way. Whoever printed it had used good paper. Probably the nicest document he had received all month. He read it standing in the hallway of his apartment building, still in his coat, grocery bag hanging from one wrist, and just let the reality of it settle. 14 days. He had 14 days. He folded the notice carefully and placed it in his coat pocket next to a crumpled grocery receipt and a prenatal vitamin he had forgotten to take that morning. Then he went inside, set down the groceries, and sat on the edge of his bed without taking off his shoes. This was the part nobody prepared you for. Not the dramatic version of Hard Times. Not the kind with a clear villain and a moment of crisis you could point to and name. Just the slow, grinding arithmetic of not having enough. Of working more than your body could carry and still watching the numbers shrink. Brio Hartwell was 24 years old. He was chubby in a way that had been commented on his entire life, mostly by people who framed their cruelty as concern. He was gentle in a way that had been called weakness by every family member who thought toughness meant hurting people first. And he was 6 weeks from his due date, working double shifts at a restaurant where the cheapest item on the menu cost more than his weekly grocery budget. The father of his child was a man named Deshaun Okafor. He wasn't around anymore. He had been around long enough to smile well and say the right things and leave before Brio could figure out that the whole thing had been temporary from the start. There was no dramatic exit. No argument. No confrontation. One day Deshaun was there. The next he wasn't. A week after that, Brio found out he was pregnant. The timing, as Brio's mother had pointed out, was deeply inconvenient. His family wasn't cruel in the obvious way. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They simply communicated through tone and silence, and the particular way his mother said, "you," when she meant, "this problem you've created." His two brothers had both presented as betas. Stable. Employed. Not prone to complications. Brio had always been the complicated one. Too soft. Too round. Too easy to disappoint. He had stopped calling home around the 4th month. Not because of a fight. Because the conversations had started feeling like performance reviews where he kept failing metrics he never agreed to. Now he sat on the edge of his bed. 14 days. The grocery bag had a box of crackers and a can of soup and a small container of orange juice because the prenatal pamphlets said vitamin C mattered. He had spent $11.40 and checked the total 3 times before reaching the register. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. A hiring link. Someone had forwarded a job listing for a full-time server position at a restaurant called Virelli's. The pay was double what he currently made. The hours were evenings only. Benefits included. He stared at the listing for a long time. He had heard the name before. Everybody had. Virelli's wasn't just a restaurant. It was the kind of place where powerful men had quiet conversations and nothing that happened inside ever ended up in a news article. The staff turnover was unusually low, which either meant the working conditions were excellent, or the employees were too scared to leave. Brio looked at the eviction notice folded in his pocket. Then he applied. Because 14 days doesn't leave much room for pride. Hi viewers, have you ever had to take a job you were terrified of just because you had no other choice? Drop your experience in the comments. The first thing Brio noticed about Virelli's was the quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The other kind. The kind a room gets when everyone inside it has learned to measure every word before speaking it. He stepped through the employee entrance on his first official shift, and immediately understood why the staff walked the way they did. Careful. Deliberate. Like people who had been reminded, more than once, that carelessness had a cost. The restaurant itself was immaculate. Dark wood. Gold light. Tables spaced far enough apart that conversations could not be overheard, which Brio suspected was the entire point. The kind of place where the menu had no prices because anyone asking the price couldn't afford to be there. Marcus, the floor supervisor who had been assigned to train him, handed him a laminated sheet with the table layout and said 2 things. The first was the table order. The second was the part Brio actually remembered. You see that back corner? The reserved section. Brio looked. That's always reserved. Those 3 tables. You don't approach them unless you're called. You don't make eye contact unless it's necessary. You don't bring anything they didn't ask for. You don't ask how their evening is going. You bring what they order. You leave. That's it. Understood, Brio said. I mean it. I heard you the first time. Marcus studied him for a moment, the way people study someone they're trying to decide is naive or just calm. Then he moved on. Brio learned the staff names quickly. Jasmine at the front. Chef Beaumont in the kitchen, who communicated mostly through implication and volume. 2 servers named Deja and Terrence who had been there long enough to know which regular customers needed to be managed rather than simply served. He also heard about the Virelli brothers. Not all at once. In pieces. The way information moves when people are careful about what they say out loud. Cashin Virelli was the oldest by minutes, and somehow everyone could tell. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When Cashin made a decision, it simply became the reality of the room. Strategic. Patient. The kind of man who finished conversations before other people realized they had started. Corvin Virelli didn't talk much. When he did, people listened the way they listened to things said softly in very serious rooms. He watched people. Not aggressively. Just accurately. Staff said he remembered everything. Every face. Every interaction. Every deviation from what was expected. Dorian Virelli smiled. That part was the problem. Because men who hold real power and still smile at you are either extremely safe or extremely dangerous. And with Dorian, nobody had figured out which one it was yet. He was unpredictable in ways that weren't violent but weren't entirely comfortable either. Brio thought about all of this, and then thought about his eviction notice, and went back to memorizing the table layout. He had rent to pay. The triplets could be complicated on someone else's time. His first real shift started at 6. By 7, he had 3 tables running smoothly. By 8, he had memorized the dietary preferences of 2 regulars without being told. By 8:43, he was carrying a tray through the main floor and heard the hostess say, quietly, "Table 9 is seated." Every server on the floor found somewhere else to look. Brio looked at table 9. 3 men. 3 identical faces. 3 sets of eyes that tracked movement the way certain animals track movement. Not like predators deciding whether to attack. Like men deciding whether something was worth their time. Cashin was reading something. Corvin was watching the room. Dorian was watching Brio specifically. Brio nodded slightly, the way you nod at a table you're not assigned to, and kept walking. Then his tray clipped the edge of the service cart. The wine glass went sideways. And the entire room held its breath. Nobody fired him. That was the first surprise. The second was what happened instead. After the incident, after the tablecloth had been changed and the guests at the affected table had been appeased with apologies and complimentary desserts, Brio expected the standard result. A pulled shift. A quiet conversation in the back office with Marcus. Paperwork. The particular tone of voice employers use when they're being professional about something that isn't professional at all. Instead, Cashin Virelli asked to speak with him. Not asked? Requested. There was a difference, and everyone in the restaurant understood it. Jasmine touched Brio's arm briefly as he walked past. Not reassuring. More like the way someone holds a door for a person they're not sure is coming back through. The private dining room was smaller than the main floor. 1 table. 4 chairs. A decanter of water that nobody had touched. Cashin sat at the far end. Corvin stood near the window. Dorian was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and an expression Brio could not categorize. Brio sat down because standing seemed worse. "You've been working here 3 weeks," Cashin said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "You've been covering table rotations for 2 other servers." Brio blinked. Deja had a family situation. Terrence had a medical appointment. Marcus knew. "You also rerouted the Hendricks reservation 2 nights ago when the table they requested was double-booked." Chef Beaumont was informed. The guests preferred the new placement. Cashin looked at him for a moment without speaking. Not hostile. Calculating. The way someone looks at a document they expected to contain one thing and found another. "You memorize preferences," Corvin said from the window. His voice was quiet enough that Brio almost missed it. "I pay attention," Brio said. "It's not complicated. The Abrams party always wants the booth nearest the north wall because Mr. Abrams has a hearing issue on his right side. The Castellano table prefers water without ice because 2 of them are older and cold water bothers their teeth. It's just observation. Most servers don't do that. Most servers don't need to. I need the income." There was a short silence. Dorian made a sound that might have been a laugh. Cashin's expression didn't shift, but something in the room did. Some incremental adjustment that Brio couldn't precisely name. "You're not afraid of us," Dorian said. Brio considered the most honest answer. "I'm afraid of losing this job," he said. "That's more immediate." Dorian looked at Cashin. Cashin looked at the table. Corvin continued looking at Brio with that steady, unreadable attention. "You're not terminated," Cashin said finally. "You're reassigned to the primary floor." Full rotation. Brio nodded once and stood. "Thank you." He was almost to the door when Corvin spoke again. Your next prenatal appointment is Thursday. Brio stopped. Marcus adjusted your Thursday schedule 3 days ago. You weren't informed. He hadn't been. He'd been planning to ask about it and kept forgetting. Your current schedule keeps Thursday morning open, Corvin said. That was all. No explanation. No commentary. Just the fact, delivered with the same flat precision as everything else. Brio walked back to the floor and stood at the service station for a moment before picking up his next order. His chest felt strange. Not warm, exactly. More like the sudden absence of cold. Like stepping inside after a long time in the wind and not realizing until that moment how long you had been out there. He didn't connect it to anything specific. He just went back to work. 3 days later, his first medical bill came back stamped paid in full. He hadn't paid it. Roland Mercer had been the floor manager at Virelli's for 6 years. In that time, he had developed a reliable system for maintaining authority. He kept the staff slightly off balance. Compliments came rarely and unpredictably. Criticism came often and publicly. People who felt uncertain about their standing worked harder to prove themselves, which Roland found useful. He had identified Brio as a problem within the first week. Not because Brio caused disruption. The opposite, actually. Brio was competent in a way that required no management. He arrived early. He covered gaps. He remembered customer details that Roland had to look up in the reservation notes. He never complained out loud, which Roland found more irritating than complaining. Competence without deference made Roland uncomfortable. And then there was the pregnancy. Visible now. Unavoidable. The kind of detail that made customers speak to Brio with something softer in their voice, which Roland resented for reasons he hadn't fully examined. It started with small things. A comment about Brio's uniform not lying flat. Said in front of Jasmine and 2 other staff. Brio adjusted the apron and said nothing. Then a remark during pre-shift briefing about servers needing to move efficiently, not waddle. Said to the group. Directed at one person. Half the room looked at the floor. Deja looked at the wall. Terrence pretended to check his phone. Brio smiled in the way people smile when the other option is something they can't afford. Roland kept going. A high-profile private event was booked for a Thursday evening. A table of 8. Wealthy investors. The kind of clients Roland needed to impress for reasons that had nothing to do with the restaurant. He assigned Brio to the adjacent service station. Visible. Inconvenient. The kind of placement that communicated something without saying it. The event started well. Then Roland stopped at the investor table mid-service and, loudly enough that 2 neighboring tables could hear, said, "Apologies for the presentation tonight. We have staff working who are not ideally suited for this environment." He glanced at Brio as he said it. Every person at that table understood what he meant. Brio stood at the service station holding a water pitcher. His hand was steady. His face was composed. He looked like someone who had practiced composure so many times it had become structural rather than voluntary. He said nothing. The investors laughed politely. The kind of laugh that means I'm not responsible for what just happened. Roland smiled. Nobody at the restaurant corrected him. Not Jasmine. Not Marcus. Not the 2 servers who had been standing close enough to hear every word. That was the part that mattered. The insult was one thing. The silence of decent people was another thing entirely. Brio set the water pitcher down carefully. Picked up the next order. Walked to the correct table. Delivered it without a single tremor in his voice. The investors moved on to their main course. Roland moved on to his next conversation. And at the back corner of the room, at the table that was always reserved, Corvin Virelli set down his glass very slowly. He had been watching the entire time. He said nothing. But his eyes tracked Roland Mercer across the room for the rest of the evening. Every step. Every movement. Without blinking. Brio typed his resignation at 2 in the morning. He sat at his kitchen table in the small apartment he had 14 more days to occupy, the resignation letter open on his phone, and read through it 3 times. It was polite, professional, effective immediately. The kind of letter that communicated everything without saying anything specific. He had been deciding since the investor event. His back hurt in a way that had stopped being occasional and started being constant. His ankles swelled by the end of every shift. His doctor had used the phrase, "monitor closely," at the last appointment, which was medical language for something Brio hadn't allowed himself to think about fully yet. He needed the income. He knew that. But there was a particular kind of exhaustion that wasn't physical. The kind that comes from having to perform fine when you aren't fine. From watching people choose silence. From learning that some workplaces treat dignity as something you earn rather than something you start with. He had been performing fine for a long time. He was running low. He stared at the letter. Then his phone buzzed with a message. Dorian Virelli. The number wasn't saved. He recognized it anyway. He had seen it on the schedule adjustment Corvin had arranged. There's a coordinator position opening. Back of house. Scheduling, vendor communication, staff logistics. Seated work, mostly. No floor service. Compensation is significantly higher. I'm asking if you want to consider it. Brio read it twice. Then a third time. He typed, "Why?" The response came back in under a minute. "Because you're good at the work. Because the floor situation last Thursday was unacceptable. And because I don't make offers twice." 3 sentences. No softness in them. No apology for Roland, which Brio noted. No promise that things would be different, which he also noted. Just an opportunity stated directly. The kind of offer that came from assessment rather than pity. He had received pity before. He knew the texture of it. How it arrived wrapped in warmth, but carried the faint assumption that you couldn't manage without help. This wasn't that. This was someone saying, "You are capable of more than what you're currently being assigned." Brio sat with it for a long moment. His resignation letter was still open in the other tab. He thought about Deshawn leaving without explanation. About his family's particular silence. About every room that had communicated, in ways that didn't require words, that he was a complication rather than a person. He thought about what it meant to keep waiting for people to change their minds about him. He closed the resignation letter. Then opened Dorian's message and typed, "I'll need the full job description and a contract before I decide." The response came back Monday. Office. 9 a.m. Don't be late. Brio put his phone face down on the table and exhaled. He hadn't said yes yet. But he hadn't said no either. And for the first time in a long time, the decision was entirely his. He went to sleep. And in the morning, when he checked the mail, there was an envelope he didn't recognize. No return address. Inside was a short printed note with a single sentence. "You're being watched. Leave before they make you a problem they can't explain." No signature. Brio read it once. Then placed it on the counter next to his prenatal vitamins, and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Someone wanted him gone. The question was whether that someone was afraid of what he knew, or afraid of what the triplets were starting to feel. Lennox Vale walked into Virelli's on a Tuesday. That was the first wrong thing. Important men with bad intentions always arrived on Tuesdays. Nobody could explain why. It was just a pattern the staff had noticed over 6 years of watching powerful people move through that dining room. Lennox was an investor. The kind with influence that stretched across industries the way certain stains spread across fabric, wide, quiet, and very difficult to remove. He had been a business associate of the Virelli family for 4 years. He wore his suits like they were weapons and spoke with the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone he respected. He noticed Brio immediately. Not the way the triplets noticed him. Not with curiosity or calculation. With something closer to irritation. Like Brio's presence in that space was a visual error that needed correcting. By that point, Brio had been coordinator for 6 weeks. And things had genuinely changed. The scheduling system ran tighter. Vendor deliveries arrived on time for the first time in 2 years because Brio had reorganized the communication chain after realizing nobody had been sending confirmation receipts. Staff called out less because someone was finally tracking patterns instead of just reacting to gaps. Even Chef Beaumont, who communicated respect by insulting people less frequently, had reduced his commentary by roughly 40%. The staff noticed. Customers noticed. Roland noticed. And Roland's noticed was different from everyone else's. He had spent 6 weeks watching Brio quietly become useful in ways that made Roland's own position feel slightly less essential. The insults had slowed down. Not because Roland had changed. Because he was recalculating. Then Lennox arrived. He sat with Roland for 40 minutes in the side dining room. The door was closed. Nobody went near it. When they came out, Roland looked the way people look when they'd been given permission to do something they already wanted to do. That evening, during the peak dinner service, a cash envelope went missing from the vendor payment box near the coordinator's office. Lennox reported it to security personally. He named Brio specifically. The allegation moved through the restaurant in under 3 minutes. By the time security reached the coordinator's office, half the floor already knew. Jasmine's face had gone tight. Deja was looking at the middle distance. Terrence had gone very still near the service counter. Brio was sitting at his desk organizing Thursday's delivery confirmations when 2 security guards appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Hartwell, we need you to come with us." He looked up. Looked at both of them. Then at the door behind them where Lennox Vale stood with his arms folded and an expression that had already finished the trial. "All right," Brio said. He set his pen down. Stood carefully, one hand briefly on the desk for balance. Followed them out. The dining room watched him walk across the floor. Nobody spoke. At the back corner table, Cash and Virelli had not moved. His hands were flat on the table. His eyes were tracking the situation with the kind of focus that happened when something had crossed a line he had previously drawn. Corvin was already on his phone. The security office door closed. And Lennox Vale smiled at the room like a man who had already won. He hadn't checked whether the cameras in the coordinator's hallway were operational. They were. They had been running all evening. Every second of it. The accusation lasted 11 minutes. That was how long it took Corvin to pull the hallway footage, timestamp it, cross-reference it with the vendor log Brio had updated at 6:42, and walk into the security office with a tablet showing exactly where the envelope had actually gone. Roland's keycard had accessed the payment box at 7:15. Brio had been in a meeting with Chef Beaumont at 7:15. 3 people confirmed it without being asked. Lennox said nothing for a long moment after the footage played. Then he said, "There may have been a miscommunication." Cashin, who had entered the security office behind Corvin without anyone inviting him, looked at Lennox for exactly 4 seconds. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Whatever he said next was quiet enough that only Lennox heard it. But when Lennox left the building 17 minutes later, he left through the back exit. And by the following morning, 3 contract agreements bearing the Virelli name had been quietly removed from Lennox Vale's portfolio. No announcement. No public confrontation. Just consequences. The staff learned about it in pieces, the way staff always learn about things. A comment here. A change detail there. The sudden absence of a name from future reservation notes. Brio was cleared. Officially, quietly, completely. He went back to work the next morning like the interruption had been a weather delay rather than a public accusation. The staff around him shifted. Something in the way they looked at him had adjusted. Not pity. Closer to recognition. The kind of regard people extend when they've watched someone get hit and stay standing without making it dramatic. 3 days passed. Then 4. Then the Friday of the following week, Brio was standing in the coordinator's office at 9:15 in the evening, checking the final delivery confirmations for the following week's inventory, when the room tilted. Not metaphorically. Literally. The desk edge came up fast and he caught it with both hands, but his legs weren't cooperating the way legs are supposed to cooperate, and the next thing he registered clearly was the floor, and then Deja's voice from the doorway, very loud, saying something he couldn't fully track. Then nothing. When he came back, there were ceiling lights and a different kind of quiet. The antiseptic smell arrived before anything else. Then the sound of monitors. Then Jasmine's voice saying his name in a way that told him she had been saying it more than once. He was in a hospital. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, and thought about the delivery confirmations he hadn't finished. A doctor arrived. Spoke carefully about blood pressure. About gestational complications. About the next 72 hours being critical in a way that required monitoring and rest and a kind of stillness Brio had not practiced in approximately 8 months. About the baby. The doctor's face did not carry reassurance the way faces carry reassurance when everything is going to be fine. Brio lay there and looked at the ceiling and said nothing for a while. Because some information needs a moment before you let it in all the way. When he finally turned his head, there was a waiting area visible through the glass partition. 3 men. Cashin. Corvin. Dorian. Not pacing. Not on phones. Not performing concern for an audience. Just sitting. Present. In chairs that were clearly uncomfortable for men their size, in a hospital waiting room at 10:47 at night, in the same clothes they'd been wearing at the restaurant. Nobody had asked them to come. They had simply come. Brio stared at them through the glass. His throat did something inconvenient. The doctor was still talking. Brio turned back and listened. But the question forming in the back of his mind was one the doctor couldn't answer. Why were 3 of the most powerful men in the city sitting in an uncomfortable hospital waiting room for a man who worked for them, when they could have sent anyone else? By the second day, Brio's condition had stabilized. The doctors used words like manageable, and responding well, and will reassess by morning, which Brio had learned to interpret correctly. Not fixed. Monitored. On a line that could move either direction. He slept in irregular intervals. Woke to monitors. Slept again. On the morning of the 3rd day, he woke to voices outside his room. Not loud. The opposite. The particular low register of a conversation people are having deliberately, with someone who understands the information being shared. He recognized Cashin's voice. Couldn't make out the words clearly, but recognized the tone. The controlled, methodical way Cashin spoke when he was building a complete picture of something. Asking questions. Listening to answers. Brio closed his eyes and let himself drift for another hour. What he didn't know, what he wouldn't know until much later, was what Cashin had spent those 3 days doing. He had started with the basics. Hospital records, with the appropriate authorizations. Employment history. Prior addresses. The financial trail of a man who had been quietly managing impossible circumstances for the better part of 2 years. Then deeper. Deshaun Okafor wasn't hard to find. His departure hadn't been impulsive. There had been conversations. Plans made before Brio knew there were plans being made. A decision that had been finalized somewhere around the 3rd month of the pregnancy, communicated to no one, executed without confrontation because confrontation might have produced accountability. Pause on that. A man who left before the door was even open. Before Brio had any way to prepare. Corvin had tracked the family contact history. The calls Brio had stopped making. The texts that went unanswered for days at a time and then came back in short, clipped sentences that managed to communicate everything except warmth. A family that framed their own discomfort as Brio's failure. That spoke about his pregnancy in terms of inconvenience and timing rather than anything that resembled investment in his future. Dorian had found the friends. Former friends. Men who had been in Brio's life before the pregnancy and had exited with varying levels of grace, which is to say most of them had exited with no grace whatsoever. Not dramatically. Just quietly. The way people get quiet when they decide someone else's hard time is more than they signed up for. Nobody had stayed. That was the whole picture. Every person who should have been present, for reasons of love or obligation or basic decency, had done their own math and walked away. And Brio had responded by working harder, being warmer, accommodating more, making himself useful in every space he occupied until usefulness was the entire basis of his presence. This is important. He hadn't become bitter. He hadn't become guarded in the obvious way. He had become someone who gave everyone else the benefit of the doubt because he had decided long ago that his own judgment about whether he deserved care was unreliable. The three of them sat with that information. Didn't discuss it loudly. Didn't announce a decision. But something had settled in all three of them in the same direction, and it had the permanence of something that isn't going to move. On the fourth morning, Brio was sitting up in the hospital bed eating something the nutrition staff called oatmeal when Dorian walked in without knocking. He sat down in the chair beside the bed, looked at the oatmeal, and said, "That looks terrible." "It's fine," Brio said. "It looks like something a building would eat." Brio almost smiled. Dorian didn't say anything else for a moment. Just sat there. Not filling the silence. Not making the moment into something it wasn't. Just present in the practical, uncomplicated way of someone who has decided where they want to be. Then Brio said quietly, "I heard you talking. This morning. Outside the room." Dorian looked at him. "You were asking about me." Not a question. "Yes," Dorian said. Brio looked at the oatmeal. "Why?" Dorian was quiet for a beat. "Because you matter. And someone needed to act like it." Brio didn't respond immediately. Because something in those 9 words landed in a place he had been keeping empty for a very long time. And he wasn't sure yet whether to let them stay. He looked up. Dorian was watching him with that expression that had never fully resolved into something Brio could categorize. And for the first time since he had started working at Virelli's, Brio felt something he hadn't planned for. Fear. Not of Dorian. Of wanting this. Of needing something this specific and not knowing what it cost to receive it. He turned back to the oatmeal. "It really is terrible," he said finally. Dorian stood up. "I'll get you something from the kitchen." He left. And Brio sat in the quiet room and thought about the fact that he had just heard 3 powerful men spend 3 days learning his entire history. Not to use it. To understand it. And the question that kept arriving, regardless of how many times he redirected it, was the same one he couldn't answer. What were they going to do with what they now knew? The charity banquet had been on the calendar for 3 months. Virelli's hosted it annually. A private event. 120 seats. The kind of gathering where influence moved quietly between courses and nothing that happened inside was ever confirmed outside. Business decisions wrapped in dinner conversation. Alliances formed between the appetizer and the dessert. Brio was not supposed to attend. He was 8 days out of the hospital. Cleared for limited activity. The coordinator role was desk work, and his doctor had approved his return on the condition that desk work meant desk work, not event management, not floor supervision, not anything resembling the pace he had been keeping before the collapse. He attended anyway. Because 6 staff members were out sick. Because the event logistics required someone who knew the vendor contacts, and the table assignments, and the specific dietary requirements of 43 guests by name. Because Brio had built the entire coordination structure for this evening over the previous 4 weeks, and walking away from it on the actual night felt irresponsible in a way he couldn't justify to himself. He sat at the coordination desk near the service entrance. Not on the floor. Not visible to most of the room. The evening ran smoothly. The kind of smooth that happens when preparation is thorough and the team executing it trusts the system they're working inside. By the time the main course was cleared, Brio had handled 11 separate logistics adjustments without anyone in the dining room noticing a single one. Then the room shifted. The particular shift that happens when a powerful person decides to make a moment public. Lennox Vale had returned. Not to Virelli's. He had no business with Virelli's anymore. But he had been invited by a separate party, a connection the Virelli family hadn't anticipated, and he was seated at a table near the center of the room with three men whose influence extended into sectors that mattered. He had been quiet for most of the evening. Then he wasn't. He said Brio's name loudly enough to carry. Something about the charity. Something about the event management. Something dressed up in language about standards and appropriateness that communicated, beneath the expensive vocabulary, exactly what Roland's comment had communicated 2 months earlier in this same building. The room didn't go fully silent. But it adjusted. The way rooms adjust when a certain kind of remark lands and people are deciding whether to respond or absorb it. Brio heard it from the coordination desk. He set down his clipboard, stood up, walked into the dining room. This was the part nobody expected. Not because it was aggressive. The opposite. Brio walked in calmly, unhurried, the way he moved through the floor during service. He stopped near the center of the room, visible to most of the tables, and said nothing for a moment. Lennox looked at him. The room looked at him. Then Cassian Virelli spoke. From the head table. Clearly. Without raising his voice. Just dropping a single sentence into the room like setting a glass down on a table. Brio. Would you join us for a moment? Not a question. Not phrased as one. The head table. Brio crossed the room and stood near the head table, and the entire room rearranged its understanding of the evening. Cassian looked at him for a moment. Then looked at the room. Then said in the same even, carrying voice, I have one question. The room went actually quiet now. Not the social quiet of polite attention. The real quiet. Cassian looked at Brio directly. Whose child are you carrying? The words landed and stayed. Because that question, in that room, in front of those people, meant something specific. It meant claim or no claim. Acknowledgement or exposure. It was the kind of question that turned a private matter into a public one, and everyone in the room understood it. Lennox was watching with an expression that expected a name. A scandal. Roland, seated 3 tables back where he had no business being at a Virelli event but had arrived as someone's guest, was watching with the particular attention of a man expecting someone else to fall. Journalists adjacent to the business tables were paying attention. Everyone was waiting for a name. An accusation? Something that confirmed what they had already decided about the chubby pregnant Omega who worked for the Virelli family. Brio stood at the head table. Looked at Cassian. Looked at the room. Took a breath. And the entire room leaned forward without moving. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Nobody counted. It just felt that specific. Then Brio spoke. His voice was even. Not loud. Just clear enough to carry to every corner of a room that had gone completely still in order to hear it. The child belongs to whoever teaches him how to be a good man. Nothing followed immediately. Not laughter. Not applause. Not the sharp intake of breath that comes after a dramatic reveal. Just silence. The kind that happens when a room full of people was ready for one thing and receives something entirely different, and the recalibration is taking longer than expected. Lennox opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. Said nothing. Because there was nothing to grab onto. No scandal. No confession. No name to circulate. No piece of information that could be shaped into a weapon. Just a sentence that reframed the entire question in terms that none of the people present had thought to prepare for. This matters. Because the question had been designed as a trap. A claim or no claim. An answer that either assigned responsibility in a way that embarrassed someone or revealed an absence that embarrassed Brio. Either direction was supposed to produce damage. Brio had walked out of the trap entirely. Not by avoiding it. By answering it with something true. The child belongs to whoever teaches him how to be a good man. The room heard it. Processed it. And somewhere in the shift that followed, the evening changed shape. The business conversations resumed slowly. Tables turned back to their own plates. The moment dissolved not with drama, but with the quiet deflation of something that had been built to explode and hadn't. Lennox Vale left before dessert. He said nothing to anyone on his way out. Roland left 10 minutes later. Also without speaking. The following week, 2 of Lennox's remaining Virelli-adjacent contracts were terminated. Not publicly. Not loudly. In the way business consequences arrive when they are delivered by people who do not need an audience. Roland Mercer submitted his resignation from Virelli's 11 days after the banquet. The letter cited personal reasons. Nobody asked for clarification. These things happened quietly. Professionally. In the manner of consequences that do not require performance because the outcome is already certain. Brio was not told the details. He found out in pieces, the way he found out most things at Virelli's. A comment from Jasmine. A changed name on the management roster. The particular absence of tension that had been present in the building since his first week. He didn't celebrate. He didn't carry it. He let it pass the way you let something pass when you've decided the better version of yourself doesn't need it to mean something. His son was born on a Thursday morning. 7 pounds 4 ounces. Healthy. Loud in the way newborns are loud when they arrive determined to make themselves known. Brio sat in the hospital bed with the baby against his chest and felt something settle in his body that he hadn't realized had been in motion. Like something had finally stopped running. He named him Marcus Elliot Hartwell. Not after anyone specific. Just because the name felt sturdy. The kind of name a person could grow into without having to work around it. Cashin, Corvin, and Dorian arrived at the hospital within the hour. Nobody had called them. They came because they had been waiting, in the specific way of people who have made a decision and are simply waiting for the right moment to say it clearly. Cashin stood near the door. Looked at the baby. Looked at Brio. And said with the same directness he applied to every decision that mattered. We want to be here. Not as employers. Not as a situation you're managing. We want to be here. Brio looked at him. Then at Corvin, who was watching the baby with an expression that was the warmest Brio had ever seen on that particular face. Then at Dorian, who was already holding out one finger toward Marcus's hand with the focused concentration of someone who absolutely had not planned to do this but was doing it anyway. Marcus wrapped his whole fist around Dorian's finger. Dorian looked up. For the first time in the entire time Brio had known him, Dorian Virelli was visibly, completely caught off guard. Dorian started. I see it, Corvin said. He did it on purpose, Dorian said. He's 4 hours old, Cashin said. Brio watched the 3 of them and felt something move through his chest that he had no efficient word for. His whole life, belonging had been something he had auditioned for. Something extended conditionally and withdrawn when conditions changed. Something that arrived with the fine print of performance and measurement. This was different. This was 3 people standing in a hospital room because they wanted to be there. Not because they had to. Not because it served anything. Because they had decided. He looked down at Marcus. Thought about what he had said at the banquet. The child belongs to whoever teaches him how to be a good man. He had meant it as an answer in the moment. But sitting here now, he understood it was also a question he had been asking himself for a very long time. Who teaches you? Who stays? Who shows up on a Thursday at 7 in the morning in a hospital room because your son arrived and they wanted to see it? The answer was standing right in front of him. Had been standing there, in varying configurations, for months. Brio looked at Cashin. Okay, he said quietly. That was all. No speech. No list of terms. No careful negotiation of what this meant, or what it would require. Just okay. And Cashin nodded once. The way he nodded when a decision had been made and the only thing left was moving forward. Corvin crossed the room and sat down in the chair next to the bed. Dorian was still looking at Marcus with an expression of complete, unguarded wonder. And Marcus, 4 hours old and already demanding, made a sound that required everyone's immediate attention. The strongest men in the city scrambled. And Brio, for the first time in his life, did not have to wonder who would stay. The answer had already made itself at home. If this story moved you, if any part of Brio's journey reminded you that belonging is a choice, not an accident, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story on this channel. Every week there's a new one. Stories about people who held on when everything said let go. Stories that remind you that the right people don't need to be convinced to stay. Drop a comment below. Tell me which moment hit you hardest. Was it the banquet? The hospital? The very first time the triplets showed up without being called? Your words in the comments inspire the next person who finds this story on a hard night. And if you've been carrying something alone the way Brio was, you don't have to keep doing that.